process because it's focused on Cameroon. Yeah, it's fine. Can record it, it's fine. So it's going to be focused on the land policy reform process that's ongoing in Cameroon, but the scope of my research is really focused on how this land policy reform process that's going on in Cameroon fits into a greater issue of government-driven land disposition. I'm going to be talking about that as well as we go, so just bear with me. So before I begin here, I just want to be a little bit of context about where I'm from with some fun facts, right? So Cameroon is one of 2 countries in the world where French and English are 2 official languages. Some of you already knew that, so why am I even wondering? So the other country is Canada. The other thing that's really cool about Cameroon is that it's considered as Africa in miniature because of its natural endowment and cultural diversity. So like in terms of cultural diversity, for example, Cameroon is home to over 200 different ethnic groups. What's interesting is that most of these ethnic factions are actually spread out across the different cultures that you see in most parts of Africa. So that's really Cameroon's really like a melting pot of what you see in different parts of the continent. And in terms of natural endowment, like I said, so you see like the on the western coast, you see like the sandy and rocky beaches. You see in the highland regions, you see mountains. You see a little bit of desert in upper northern sections, and the tropical dense forest in the southern part. So it's really diverse in terms of what we can see in a really small country. It's only 475,000 kilometers square, but it has so much into one country. Another fun fact, which is kind of bringing back to what I'm going to be talking about, is that Cameroon's current piece of land legislation is over more than 45 years old because it was actually enacted in 1974. And today, although there's a current ongoing land policy reform to change that land law, it's important to note that Cameroon has been using this same land law for over 45 years. So that's older than 87% of the country's population from the census that was conducted in 2010, obviously. And also, so there's this issue of government-driven land disposition that I'm going to be talking about that, you know, it's really an important issue that's critical for the development of this country of Cameroon, that's really hurting a lot of the big cities of like Douala and Yaoundé. So I just wanted to highlight those key things before I move into the presentation per se. And so where's Cameroon located? Like, just to give you a little bit of geographical context for those of you who do not know where Cameroon is. So it's in the continent of Africa, right? On the western central part of Africa, like at the armpit, if you want to call it that way. So the area where I'm going to be focusing my research is on the left side, you see the map of Cameroon, and the little circle just shows you the area where I'm from in the littoral region. I was born in Douala, and that's also sort of where I'm going to be doing my research, at least one of the study sites where I'm going to be doing my research. So I talked about government-driven land disposition in my title, but it's important that we build some context here, right? The way I look at government-driven land disposition is basically unethical practices, unethical land expropriation practices that are characterized by unjustified land takings and the eventual displacement of customary holders of land holdings by government authorities. If you want to put this in a very simplistic word, is basically the process whereby the government takes land of local communities without a due process, without compensating them. And also, it's important to note that government-driven land dispositions are sometimes backed by the law, because within the context of the 1974 law, for example, that I referenced, you know, the Cameroon government is authorized to take community lands that have not been registered. And I'm going to be explaining a little bit more about, you know, I'm going to give a historical framework around Cameroon's land policy, but I just wanted to highlight that this is the definition of government-driven land disposition. The way I look at it is like the government having so much power within land legislation and administration, and that gives them the authority to just grab land as they see fit. And there's just that little nice cartoon that I just thought it would be nice to just highlight how I'm looking at it. Frozen here, maybe. Move on to the next. There you go. So I want to build context, right? I want to build historical context around, you know, the land question in Cameroon. Who owns land? How has it been governed over time? And so it's important to note that the scramble for Africa, as many of you might know, started in the 1880s after the Berlin Conference, and Cameroon was actually colonized in 1884 by the Germans. And so when that happened, the treaty itself was signed in Douala, where I'm from. Well, my parents are from somewhere else, but we moved to Douala. So the treaty was signed in Douala, and the Douala chiefs at the time thought, you know, we have a Western power coming to help us, you know, develop and grow. But what they didn't know was that the colonizers were coming to and had their vested interests. And so in 1884, they just signed this treaty saying that they're going to agree to German colonialism, basically. And so what they noticed in 1885 was that the Germans had lied to them, and they started to intensify their I would say the predatory practices of acquiring native lands for building like plantation businesses and just for German interests, and all of the crops that they were growing, some of these plantations that they started were just shipped back out. And so what the Douala chiefs and a lot of the interland chiefs in Cameroon noticed, and they were angry at that because they had been lied to. And so a good example of this was in 1914 when the Douala King Rudolf Mangabel and Douala Mangabel were actually hanged because he revolted against the German authorities against one of the land policies. And because the land policies were so predatory, they were just exploiting the native, enslaving the population. And so the chiefs themselves were not happy about that. So that led to the killing. They were murdered by the Germans. So it's important to note also that during the First World War, the British and the French colonial powers actually put themselves together to combat the Germans in Cameroon. And so that's how in 1916, Cameroon fell under the protectorate of the French and the British, and the Germans were kicked out of the country, basically. And so fast forward from 1916, the land sector, if you want to put it that way, of Cameroon was governed by the Germans and the French, and the country was split into two, a French-speaking area and an English-speaking area. And so in 1932, predominantly, it's important to note that the French had a huge portion of the country. So like Cameroon right now has 10 regions. And if you want to put that into context and do a little bit of math, the French had 8 regions and the British had only 2 regions. And so the French way of land governance was basically identifying the role of indigenous and traditional communities. But what they did was, with these traditional authorities, what they did was they used them as overseers of land, but these traditional authorities like chiefs never really had the power to control the land. So the French mandate still had a lot of the power around land governance. And then so fast forward to 1959, which was 1 year before Cameroon actually got its independence from the British and the French, a new land law that governs state property was actually enacted in the country. This law actually still recognized indigenous rights and ownership to land, but still, for some reason, had that standard way of sort of centralized and bureaucratic way of having the government as a central power and so forth. So in 1959, that's what happened. So state property took over, and although indigenous people and local communities could still own land under customary land rights, the government still had all of the power. Now, so fast forward to 1974, after the country had owned its independence, a new law was basically enacted by Cameroonians, because at the time, President Amadou Ahidjo was in power. And so this law was, in essence, to move away from colonial laws and to have a law that was made by Cameroonians for Cameroonians. There are a lot of problems that this 1974 law had that I'm going to be talking about, but this is just like a historical evolution of how Cameroon evolved from the colonial period up until 1974. But what happened after 1974 really? And what's the problem with the 1974 land law? Well, one of the crucial issues is that there was this huge amount of, if you want, a systemic change from the traditional way of looking and managing land, so which we call customary land tenure, to a statutory regime for land administration. In essence, what that meant was the chiefs that had previously had some kind of authority in land management and governance during the French and British mandate, well, they didn't have that anymore. Now the state had all the power in land formalization. So if you needed land, for example, in Cameroon, you had to register them with the state, and so forth, otherwise you would lose it. The other problem that the 1974 land law created, which is even more concerning, was the fact that the amount of power vested on the government resulted into unjustified expropriation of local community lands, especially customary land rights, through compulsory land acquisitions. So compulsory land acquisition is actually a key facet of the 1974 land law, because it allows the government to legally acquire community lands if those lands are not registered with the state. Because remember, in 1974, in order to own land, you had to register them with the state. And so the amount of power that the government had was just incredible. And this allowed them to take land from communities at will. So let's use an example. Like I said, this research that I'm doing is very close to my heart. It's very personal. So let me just share my story with you. So I came to Antioch in 2018, but prior to that, what I experienced in the neighborhood where I grew up, which is Mabanda in the city of Douala, was that, this whole house or community of over 3,000 people where I lived was literally destroyed and demolished by the government, the municipal government in Douala. And what they told us was that this land was reserved for government projects. The funny thing about this is that most of these people who lived there, including my father, had land titles. Now, the question I kept asking myself is, how legitimate were these land titles? At the time, I didn't really have all these answers, but how legitimate were the land titles, and was the government allowed to do that? Well, a closer look to the 1974 land law would say that the government is legally supposed to do this without compensating, because most of the land titles that were owned in this area were unclear in terms of how they were gotten. The funny part too is that the process for land title acquisition in Cameroon from 1974 up until today, if you want, it's a nightmare, especially if you don't have money and you don't understand the process. And a lot of low-income communities in Cameroon don't really understand the process for acquiring land, and so they're often a victim of land dispossession, like the one that happened in Mabanda. And so the other thing that was really striking about the Mabanda issue was that not only were these people ousted out of their land without compensation or relocation assistance, but the land was left in wilderness for many years. And then when in 2018, the government started to, what they thought would be nice to build, right now they're building a road that connects that area to the main highways in Douala, and they're also trying to build some industrial buildings there. So they're building something there. And it's also important to note that, the issue in Mabanda is just a reflection of what is happening in different other communities within the littoral region where Cameroon is. And so this is just a map from the community urban development, which is the urban community district of Douala, showing the different red circles at the different areas in Douala where, communities have been ousted out of their land due to legal compulsory land acquisition principles without a due process or without compensation or relocation assistance. So this is something that is not just, it's happening still. And the need for a land policy reform process that would take into account all these different issues that the government failed to account for in 1974 is really important. And so this is where really my research comes in. This is where everything really connects for me. So like there's an ongoing land policy process happening in Cameroon right now. It started in 2017, and the goal at the time was to get it delivered by 2021. Obviously with COVID and everything happening in the world, the time frame has been adjusted. But the key thing here is that I think there's a typo there. I'm sorry about that. Where does it come from? So the key thing here is that the president came out and announced that he was going to start a process for land reforming in Cameroon, but his motivations were strange, because he said that it was mainly to facilitate investor access to land primarily, and then to invite civil society to participate as part of that process. So you clearly understand that his primary motive for doing this land reform process was mainly to attract agricultural investment, because within the context of Cameroon, for example, we see a lot of agricultural and foreign investment from like the Chinese getting huge parcels of lands. So the point here is that the government of Cameroon was really trying to attract investors, access to land, basically. And so the key thing to note within this context of land reform in Cameroon is that they're really the government is trying to adopt sort of a participatory process, in that they're trying to invite previously disenfranchised members of the society, like the civil society groups and traditional authorities, to really participate in that process of land reforming, which is novel in Cameroon, which is something we've never seen before. So that's important to note as well. So as part of this process for land reforming in Cameroon, there's the LandCam project, which is a consortium of 3 organizations within Cameroon and the rest of the world. This project was funded by the EU, and what they're really trying to do is really to monitor and track the process of land reforming in Cameroon. So, and they've identified key stakeholders that they think are important within that policy reform process. They've identified the national government. Obviously, they're the ones that started the program, so they would be obviously a part of the process. Traditional authorities, sort of the chiefs, the civil society groups, the private sector groups, and the local government. So these are the target groups that the LandCam project is really trying to get to be on the same table when it comes to rewriting Cameroon's land policy. However, there's some key issues within the 1974 land law that this new approach to land reform is aimed at changing. I've probably mentioned some of them already. The fact that, you know, in the post-colonial period, we were trying to stay away from the colonial way of managing and using land, but however, we still sort of copied some of those ways of dominating indigenous communities by putting so much power in the hands of the government. And the other thing that's an important issue to investigate, that I'm trying to investigate, is, you know, because there were frequent and intense land conflicts between traditional or customary rights and the state law over land ownership. You remember how I spoke about the shift from, you know, traditional land tenure regimes to statutory ones. So this is constant conflicts between who owns power over land and how does that, you know, how does that play out within the context of Cameroon? And also the fact that, you know, the state law actually really diminished communities' rights to land, and the fact that you only had access to land if you had registered it with the state, and if you had not registered it with the state, you stood a really high chance of losing your land. And also the lack of a due process. You know, I talked about, you know, the lack of compensation and access to justice and consultation of local communities when these land expropriation events happen. So these are all the key things that are really important to me as I'm thinking about how this land policy reform process is really going to change the course of things in Cameroon. And also, what does that mean in terms of inclusiveness and transparency for the stakeholders that are going to be involved within that process of land reforming? So here are some questions that I'm thinking about. These are not fully grounded research questions yet, but they're just questions that I'm thinking about as I'm going into my research at the moment. What the stakeholders consider as important and challenging in view of, you know, mitigating future government-driven land disposition through the ongoing land policy reform process? Because these questions really aimed at, for me, to understand what the perspective of stakeholders in view of, you know, how do we prevent future land government positions of land, and what seems to be the challenge that can help, what are the challenges that could affect that future that we want to see, and what are some strategies for overcoming those challenges, obviously. The other question that I'm thinking about is what procedural distributive justice insights can be gleaned from the ongoing land policy process in Cameroon, given that we're adopting a multi-stakeholder participatory process. Like I said, you know, those different target groups that we're using, that Cameroon is currently planning to use in its land policy reform prospects, it will be interesting to see how those different stakeholders really contribute to that process, and how we really distribute those levels of powers within the other community members, the local communities that are not really represented per se. And also, to what extent are stakeholders involved in the land policy process, and why does each group really assume the role they do? Because if the national government is really the one writing the policy, we want to know why they are assuming that role. And if the civil society is just making suggestions that maybe not considered, why is everyone assigned the role that they're assigned? So things like that will really help me understand the process in a view of making a way forward. So I think that's it for me, really. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. I don't know if I should stop sharing, that way I can see everyone. I think I'm gonna do that. There we go.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Jack, for sharing. I really like the historical context of Cameroon, and also the idea behind land policies. And so, yeah, so it's open up for questions. If someone have a question, they can go ahead and shoot.
Hi, Ray.
All right. Well, I have a question. So when you talked about you know, the idea of the law behind the state law and also the local communities within the area and the idea of like what roles and who is assigned to what role. I was wondering like what is the representation in terms of those local communities and the state law, who is being represented in, you know, are there meetings being held to discuss who has rights and whose voice is being heard? And are there anything being done to mitigate those land conflicts between local communities and the state government?
Good question. I think the first part of the question was about how a local community's voice is represented as part of the land policy reform process. So LandCam is actually, the LandCam project that I talked about, referenced, is actually a process that's really aimed at actually achieving that. So what they've been doing is they've been really consulting local communities in different parts of Cameroon and really understanding what the relationship is with land and how they want to see this process of policy reform affect them. And so they've been giving their suggestions and recommendations to LandCam, and what LandCam is doing within these meetings that they're having with different stakeholders is really to report back to these different stakeholder groups and telling them exactly how they see the perspective of local communities. In regards to the conflict point you asked about, I think this is something that's still ongoing because ultimately the goal is to minimize them as much as we can. Fundamentally, I think the fact that the Cameroonian government actually invites everyone to participate in the process really makes it for a minimization of those conflicts that we've seen in the past. However, it's still ongoing, so I don't really have a fully fleshed answer for you at this point, but I think the fact that we already have that process in place can help us sort of get some answers at this point. So yeah, but there's so much to learn still. I think Joshua had a question, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh no, I didn't have any question.
Oh, sorry. I think I saw an icon, something on the picture. Sorry. Yeah, there's no questions. I probably did a really poor job, or I did an amazing job.
Jacques, I'm wondering, as you think about conducting your research out in the field, what do you anticipate the challenges of data collection being, and how are you going to try and manage that?
That's a good question, Jason. Thank you for asking that. So I think the most obvious one, and I think it's not just unique to Cameroon right now, is the fact of the global pandemic, right? That has made it possible. That has made it almost impossible for people to meet face to face, to conduct interviews. If you wanted to have like direct, interactions with people, that could be an issue. But also the fact that see, I'm Cameroonian. I've been out of the country for a very long time, doing my studies here in the US, and the fact that I've been out for so long, maybe connecting at a deeper level with some of the stakeholders that are involved in this process might be an issue. I don't know for sure that's going to be an issue, but I anticipate some power struggles there. So yeah, those are some of the key things that I'm thinking about at the moment.
Does Cameroon have any more restrictive COVID guidelines? I know certain countries compared to the US are more restrictive in terms of travel and stuff like that. Yes, that's a good question too, Mike. So at the moment, what I do know is that Cameroon has it's a slight travel ban. Like it's unless you're going to Cameroon for like a really urgent situation. So like such as like a loss of someone dear to you and things like that, then you probably get a visa. In the beginning of the pandemic, the traveling to Cameroon was completely stopped. But right now they're reopening their frontiers, and it'll be interesting because I've been thinking about ways to, as I speak to you right now, I don't know if I'll be able to go because I don't have a visa yet. But I anticipate that it might be a little difficult to get in there. But I'm trying to work with I have a few folks within the LandCam project folks that are helping me to speak with the embassy to try to get me, a visa. But yeah, I anticipate that it might be a little bit difficult to get there.
Dr. Bina has a question in the chat. She wants to know, what other local land rights struggles within the African continent or the global South are you looking at as references or comparisons?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for your question, Dr. Obena. I have to say that within Sub-Saharan Africa, there's so many great examples of, case studies, that have done, that have started a land policy reform process, and in every single case, they've defined their success and failures in different ways. I'll take the example of Mozambique's land policy reform, right? This is something that happened many years ago, and what they really did was something similar, but a little bit different from what we're seeing in Cameroon right now, is that the government came out and said, we're going to reform, we're going to reform our land policies, and we're going to invite, we're going to have a national land campaign so that, people are going to go to local, rural and urban communities and speak to people about our plans to get this land law going. And they collected, information from all these different communities, and the recommendations that were done from all these land campaigns were brought back to the government, and integrated into the land policy framework as they envisaged it. So yeah, there are different examples that are there to be looked at within the African context, but I think the one in Cameroon is really unique in that it's I think for the fact that we're in 2021 and this is something that's happening, I never personally thought that I would be talking about, land policy reform and thinking about my government, inviting different, communities to have an input, a say as part of that process, because for obvious reasons. But yeah, so it's just really nice to see that Cameroon is actually learning from examples such as the one in Mozambique, where the views and perspective of different stakeholder groups, such as local communities, were actually considered as part of that process. So yeah, so I'm looking at examples like the Mozambique experience. There's also the Mali experience. Recently, DRC actually started a progressive approach similar to Cameroon's, which is inviting different stakeholders to participate in the process as well. So there are a lot of examples too that you can think of. Right, appreciate that, thank you.
We have another couple of minutes for any questions for Jacques. I don't see Mario on our Zoom, so something may have come up that prevented him from joining, and I haven't heard from him. Mario, if you happen to be out there in one of these boxes, jump in and say hey. But let's take a minute. Any more questions for Jacques? And Jacques, thanks again so much for taking the time to join us and for the thoughtful presentation.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everybody.
I have one more question. How do you hope your results will be used, and what steps might you take to promote their use in that way? Like, what kind of impact do you want them to have and where?
That's a great question. So so in the beginning of my, my thinking about this research, I was going straight with like an advocacy thought of it, like this research is going to change everything in Cameroon. I'm going to go talk to the government. This is what I want them to do. But I've also learned that, in academia, if you want the most effective results, advocacy is not often the best way to go, especially because I need to work with the government as part of this process. So what I want to achieve at the end of this research is first and foremost for Cameroonians of all ages, education level, technical level, social studies, to understand what the land policy framework that's going on in Cameroon right now is. What does that mean for them? And what does that mean for them in fear of losing their land rights someday, right? Because there's an ongoing land policy framework. They see it on TV. Most of them don't really understand what's happening. So at the end of the day, my goal is to really make sure that I put something together that would tell someone else like my dad that, listen, this is what Cameroon is doing right now to protect someone else from losing their land. You remember that thing that happened to you in 2014? This is how the government is going about changing that process. This is what they're doing. And it's just these little things that I think my research will really help, put to the frame in view of preventing future government-driven land. Although my ultimate goal would be to see the government actually acting on what they're saying, because seeing someone else losing their land in 2021 or 2022 would be almost defeating for me. So while I don't want to see that, I also want everyone to be aware of where they stand within the new land policy framework.
Yeah, one more thing I thought was really interesting was that, where I'm from, Nigeria, it's when the state are trying to develop a land for economic reasons, sometimes they fail to acknowledge the people who are in that land prior to that development, and they also fail to compensate them enough so they can actually have a way of living when they are relocated to a different place because of those lands are being grabbed for governmental reasons and developmental reasons. And I think that's something I found that is interesting to see how it goes on in Cameroon as well. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing the experience in Nigeria, Precious. I think it's important that these conversations are happening right now, and that relocation and compensation assistance principles are embedded within the new context. And so I think there's progress definitely being made to make sure everyone is taken into account as we think about the new framework. So it's really great.
That was really awesome. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I wanted to point out that I think what you said about like what you wanted your research to do, like instead of having the like mentality, even though like it's not wrong, to be like, oh, I want this to change completely 100%, like the government needs to realize blah, 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 to like enact small incremental change so that over time it leads up to like big change and it never happens to anybody again. Like that's really awesome, and I think you're on the right track. So thank you for sharing.
Appreciate that, Ashley. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody.